All right. JJ, before we start with the questions, I guess for people who don't really know about you, I guess you can introduce yourself in a way for people who are here who are not your fans, who are new to you.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Jjm McCullough. I'm a YouTuber and a journalist based out of Vancouver, British Columbia. Um, I write a weekly column for the Washington Post about Canadian politics for an international audience. And I also make weekly YouTube videos that are sort of broadly about themes of culture and countries and politics and government and stuff. I mean, it's not an overtly political channel, but in my capacity at the Washington Post, I am a political columnist. I'm generally a more sort of conservative-minded person, and that's the perspective that I generally write from. But in terms of my YouTube channel, it's just kind of I talk about history and the different countries of the world and cultures and government stuff, but less sort of partisan commentary.
All right, we're going to go down the list here. Some questions may not be entirely political, as said previously. Some of them will, like this one right here. Like the first question's already like a non-political question, but I get Richard Head asks, "Do you play video games? What is your favorite?"
I don't really play video games very much anymore. I just don't really have the time for it. In fact, I bought a Nintendo Switch several months ago, and just a couple of days ago, I lent it to my friend to borrow for God knows how long because I just was never playing it. I mean, when I was young, I played a lot of video games. I'm 36 years old, so I grew up at a time when everybody was playing NES and SNES games. And so when I think about my favorite games, it's still generally games from that era. My favorite game of all time is probably Super Mario World or Donkey Kong Country 3. Those are like two games that I feel like I could just pick up and play at any time and still enjoy them.
Yeah, I mean, that's just true. I remember a lot of people who are from that era tend to have like a very like Nintendo esque type of not bias, but
Well, yeah, no, I mean, when I was a kid, when I was growing up in the 1990s, like the culture was such that you really sort of had to be a firm loyalist of either Team Nintendo or Team Sega. And that was sort of like my first experience in being a sort of hardcore partisan of one flavor or another. I was a real Nintendo partisan, and I would hear no praise given to Sega, which I was just entirely convinced was a deeply, deeply inferior system and company. So that has, and I mean, those sort of habits that you form in childhood often carry over into adulthood, and still to this day, to the extent that I'm still sort of interested in video games, my first instincts and loyalties is to still pay attention to what Nintendo is up to, as opposed to what Sony or Microsoft is up to.
Yeah, that's 100% true. I mean, I was more of a Sega person, but anyway, I mean, you gotta go fast. I mean, to be honest, Nintendo is better in my opinion in terms of because they're not third party. They don't do third party like how Sega did. And I think, like the business practices of like Sega, like all they had to do was not do anything, but they decided to go on and take a risk, and it didn't pay off. I think with the CD or something. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's kind of the funny thing about it in retrospect is that I feel very vindicated because obviously Nintendo did win, right? Like Nintendo was still a very dominant company, whereas Sega's, like a third-party provider, a shell of its former self. It's no, I mean, and Sega had. I remember. I feel like sort of the beginning of the end was like the Sega Dreamcast, right? Like their alternative to the Nintendo 64 and that sort of generation of game. And the Dreamcast got some early praise, but it really sort of seemed to have flopped, and it seems like Sega never really recovered from that. And then I guess sort of like in the early 2000s, they kind of just bit the bullet and became a software provider for Nintendo. And yeah, it's we would have never guessed such a thing would have happened in the heat of the 1990s.
Yeah, no, I completely understandable. I think it's a really like interesting thing like to speak about because it does talk about business practices and such, but and tribalism in a way with that when Nintendo is at Sega. But the next question is from I think it's pronounced Iosfranis, and he asks, "What do you think is the cause of the rise in nationalism across the world?"
Well, I mean, I think
Wrong
that we
question.
live in a deeply sort of globalized age. I mean, if I remember when I was going to college in sort of the early 2000s, that was sort of the tagline of the time. Everything that we studied was sort of viewed through the premise of the fact that we're living in an increasingly globalized world. You know, not only sort of the globalization of sort of international capitalism and the fact that business and international commerce is much more ubiquitous than it was a few decades ago. But also we've seen sort of like the globalization of threat, the globalization of things like terrorism, which have no borders, groups like Al Qaeda, which operate all over the world. Like that was a very sort of dominant theme of the sort of like early 2000s. And I think it was sort of inevitable that there would be a backlash to it, as there always is a backlash to everything, that there becomes a sort of course correction. And sort of the globalism, which was so celebrated in the 1990s, started to develop an increasingly sort of vocal faction of critics on both the left and the right, who saw it sort of as as a force for, whether it's a force for wealth inequality or sort of a force for stirring up global tensions or putting sovereignty at risk, and thus sort of weakening the nation state's ability to defend its own people. So, I mean, I think that a lot of the nationalism is kind of a rebuke to that, is a sort of rebuke to not only sort of like the very sort of real deficiencies of globalism as a sort of philosophy of government, but also sort of its inability to satisfy, I suppose, some sort of yearnings that I think are sort of an inescapable part of sort of the human existence. That people want to be. There's a line that our former prime minister, that Stephen Harper once used, where it's sort of like the conflict between people that are somewheres and people that are anywheres. That there are people in this world who are very tied to one specific part of the world or one community or one country or city or whatever. And then there's some people that are the anywheres, that are these very sort of transcendent people that can kind of go and do whatever they want. And so I think that there's been a sort of sense that the world has been far too geared towards the needs of the everywheres and not geared towards enough of the needs of the somewheres. And so I think that we're seeing a little bit of the backlash of the somewhere community.
I would ask you, in your opinion, do you think it's a correct type of analysis to make where European nationalism is perceived as more negative than American nationalism, for example? Because whenever European nationalism had an uprising, there's been usually signs of, bigotry and overall intolerance of different cultures and such, or different of people of different national origins. While in America, there are some aspects of that, but nowhere near as much as European, especially Eastern Europe, like Poland, for example. Like, would you say that's like a correct, like almost like a analysis to make, where American nationalism is perceived as more positive than European nationalism?
I think so. I think that sort of historically, American nationalism has always been a sort of what they would call a sort of civic nationalism, right? So it's a nationalism that is ultimately defined by citizenship, and that barriers around citizenship can, of course, be bigoted and can be cruel and can be discriminatory, as there's lots of examples of that happening in American history. But it is ultimately a kind of gatekeeping that is ultimately fought through the law, because it is understood, even your average white American understands themselves to be a product of not any one particular nation state, right? That most sort of white Americans are byproduct of many different sort of peoples of Europe. Many white Americans have lost track of even what their own family heritage is. And so the only sort of identity that they can identify with is, either American, or sort of in a more negative fashion, a sort of white American. But even then, white American is just a so much broader category than some of the more sort of bigoted nationalisms in Europe, which are entirely based around being a very, very hyper-specific type of person. So it's not just that you're a white European or even a white Frenchman. It's like you're you're a Catholic Frenchman from this very particular part of the country, and you're very jealous and very guarded about that particular conception of what it means to be a French person. And that, the people could argue okay, that's a sort of historic definition of what it meant to be French if we go back, centuries or whatever. But that kind of appeal to that kind of history is just something that's not part of sort of the American tradition or the American history. Even the American history of bigotry and discrimination is not as narrow as it has been historically in Europe. So I think it's true. I consider myself pretty critical of nationalism. Not a big fan of it, in part because I think it really emphasizes this same kind of sort of arbitrary gatekeeping of communities, which I just think are often based on a lot of false premises and fantasy and sort of make-believe, to be perfectly honest. But that stuff that I have the biggest problems with with when it comes to nationalism is just much more prominent in European culture or in the European conception of nationalism and national identity than it has ever been in sort of the American understanding of it.
Yeah, I know that you. It's also interesting to say that nationalism in Canada is from more of the left wing part of Canadian politics than the right wing part of Canadian politics. I found that really interesting because there is kind of this reality that Canadian nationalism came from, in a sense, it was very connected to just not being American in a way. And I think that's interesting, that nationalism doesn't necessarily have to come from the right wing, but it can come into many different shapes and forms. And,
I think that that's true. I think that it is. I think that kind of nationalism, though, is a product of the fact that we're in the New World, So in the same way that I was talking about American nationalism as being a kind of civic nationalism that can be sort of fought through the law, the same is true of Canadian nationalism, right? So it's like Canadian nationalism is a sort of civic nationalism that is based around, like you said, not being American, right? But not being American is not a race, right? Like it's not a racial conflict. It's not like the Pakistanis defining themselves as not being Indian on the basis of religion, right? So it is a civic nationalism, and it is a nationalism of a kind of bigotry. It's a nationalism that I don't have much time for, this Canadian nationalism. But even then, it is very much a nationalism that has to sort of be fought through these kind of very new, diverse, multi-ethnic, democratic societies that we've sort of created in the New World. It's the same is true, actually, incidentally, of a lot of the nationalisms in South America, which are often quite left-wing as well. And those too are defined by a sort of nationalism that's often very anti-American, very much based around a sort of like rejection of the oppression of the Yankee and this kind of thing. And so, but that's not really a kind of style of nationalism that I think you would see in Europe quite as much. Because in some ways, I suppose sort of like the left-wing nationalisms of the New World are much more about sort of rejecting a kind of other, a very specific other, whereas in, I think, a lot of the European nationalisms, it's about affirming a kind of group identity, a collective group identity. And like I said before, defining that collective group identity in very specific terms, hyper tied to specific geography, specific race, specific religion, and all that kind of thing. So that's a very big difference, I think, between when we think about nationalism. I think we should think about it in terms of like New World nationalism and Old World nationalism.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's a good way of analyzing it. But we'll go on to the next question. This is a question from Frankie. I've been obsessed with the Canadian Atlantic Islands for a year or so, but it seems like you always brush over them in videos. Have you been to any of them? I'd love to hear more from a Canadian.
Yeah. So yeah, I have never been to Atlantic Canada. These are sort of like the 4 provinces in the furthest east of the country. Very small places. So like their populations are quite small, and that's probably one of the reasons why I just don't talk about them that much, because they don't really exert that much sort of cultural or political influence in Canada, and so they are, unfortunately, easily ignored parts of the country. But I would like to visit them someday. It just the opportunity hasn't presented itself. The other thing too is that travel in Canada is very, very expensive. It's one of the most expensive countries in the world to travel domestically because the landmass is just so gigantic, and that we have, you know, a decided lack of competition in the airline industry. I would blame as well. So the idea of just sort of hopping on a plane to check out, you know, New Brunswick or Nova Scotia or Newfoundland, like it's just hasn't really been something that I've ever sort of considered seriously, just because of the cost involved, and also I just don't know how interested people are. I mean, the history of the province of Newfoundland is something that I know people tend to be a little bit fascinated by, because Newfoundland was a different country before it joined Canada in 1949. So that's sort of an interesting story. And maybe someday when travel is again legalized, I'll think about going there and maybe making a video about that part of the country.
Yeah, I think it's I see you doing it because you've been to different parts of the world. Like you went to Chile, and then you've been to parts of
Yep.
America. I do actually find it kind of funny that you didn't actually go to those parts of Canada yet. But I mean, if it's really that expensive, then I can understand why.
Well, it's also I honestly just don't really have any connection there. So it's like everywhere I've traveled, I've usually traveled because I have like friends there that I'm going to see and hang out with. You know, like when I went to Chile, I was staying with a friend of mine who lives there with his wife, right? So, and same within all the other sort of travel videos I've done. I've always had a connection, and I honestly just don't really know anybody in Atlantic Canada, so I don't really have any connections. So that would just make the trip that much more expensive too, because then, you know, I'm having to stay in a hotel and yada yada yada. So yeah, there's from my perspective, there's some good reasons why I haven't explored that part of the country much.
All right. The next question is from Atomic Penguin, and he asks, "What do you think the Conservative Party of Canada needs to do to win in Canada? Do they need to go further to the right or middle? Is the Conservative Party a lost cause in Canadian politics?" It's a pretty loaded
It's
question.
well, no, I mean it's a good question, and I mean I was thinking about this earlier today. You know, it is not clear to me that the Conservative Party has won any recent election entirely on the basis of its own pitch to voters. I think that when you look at, like, in say the last 20 years, the amount of support that the Conservative Party has had in general elections has been relatively consistent. You know, it's like in the sort of mid 30s to high 30s. You know, somewhere in that broad range. It never gets, you know, terribly below that, but it never gets much higher than that. And so as a result, like a lot of the Conservative Party's fortune has been dictated by what's happening with the other two parties, right? So it's when the NDP is very strong, there tends to be that tends to work out well for the Conservatives, because it means that there's a vote split on the left, and that means that the Conservative Party can edge out narrow pluralities. And what's most important to understand about Canadian politics and the Canadian three-party system is that politics in this country is largely played over winning pluralities. It's not played over winning a majority of public support. It's getting just enough to squirm through with like a 35% of the vote or whatever that gets you elected to a seat in Parliament. And then you get enough of those elections across the country, and then, you know, you win the majority government or whatever, and it makes your government seem like it's much more popular than it is, even though when you look at the national popular vote, you only won, like, you know, under 40% of the popular vote. So that being said, you know, it's hard to really know what lessons to take from the Conservative Party's victories in the recent past. So Stephen Harper, the Conservative Prime Minister, was elected 3 terms in a row during a time at which the NDP was quite strong, and then that worked in his favor. And so there is a sort of revisionist theory, you could say, which is that Stephen Harper's success as Prime Minister was kind of overrated, because ultimately his political fortune was dictated by sort of circumstances beyond his control, which is to say what was going on in the NDP and what was going on in the Liberal Party, and the sort of conflict between these two factions of the Canadian left. And so, yeah, so like that's kind of like increasingly sort of like what I think about it. And that sort of makes me a little bit sort of apathetic and a little bit disengaged from what's happening in the Conservatives right now, and these sort of questions of, well, should the Conservative Party go more left wing or should it go more right wing? Stephen Harper was sort of, when he sort of first came onto the scene, he was sort of written off as someone who was too right wing to get elected Prime Minister of Canada, and yet he did it 3 times. And some people would say, well, that shows that the Canadians are sort of more tolerant of a sort of right wing, openly sort of conservative, hard-edged message than we perhaps give them credit for, and that therefore the Conservative Party should emulate that approach. But on the other hand, we had Stockwell Day, who ran for prime minister in the year 2000, and he was the head of the Conservative Reform Alliance Party before the Conservative Party existed, and he didn't do so well. So it's a little bit more complicated, I think, than just a strict matter of left versus right, just knowing the nature of the Canadian 3-party system. But that being said, I do think it is very important for the Conservative Party to have a message that they can run on, that they can feel confident about championing, and that their own base will feel proud of and will line up to support, and that this will motivate candidates and will motivate voters and will motivate a sort of larger conservative movement in the media and activists elsewhere that are sort of prepared to line up behind that. And I think that the biggest challenge for the Conservative Party right now is less about sort of defining themselves ideologically and more about just kind of like identifying the issues that they really want to make their own. Like, what are the issues that they want to fight on and sort of take the initiative in making sort of like the dominant story of Canadian politics. Because often when we talk about, should they be more right wing, should they be more left wing, we're really just talking about like, well, how vigorously should they oppose the Liberal Party? And I think that you can't define a party strictly in terms of its sort of reaction to the government. They have to sort of have an independent agenda of their own. And I think that agenda, sort of trying to define that agenda, is really the biggest challenge that's facing Conservatives in this country at the moment.
Yeah, I do think that's interesting, though, because in America, we kind of have this way of thinking as well, where whenever a third party that is more associated with one of the other two parties, like the Green Party is often associated to be more left-wing, therefore, whenever there is an election, and an example of it is like 2000 with Gore and Bush, where the third party, what was it? I forgot the guy's name, but he was
Nader.
Yeah, Ralph Nader. Yeah, I remember Ralph
Yeah.
Nader. He got a certain amount of votes, and they asked them, well, okay, if you could have voted just for Gore or Bush, who would you voted for? Some of them said, I think 30% said Gore, then 15% said Bush, and then everyone else said they would have stayed home. And then if you do the math there, Gore would have won. And it's like, I think, and obviously with Canada, it's a bit more, it's a lot more prevalent, because unlike in America, third parties actually have a shot at making a sort of impact on the electorate, because the NDP is more liberal or more left wing than the Liberal Party. So I do find that interesting. But yeah, I'm not sure who was the guy that lost to the Conservative Party candidate. He went to go on to make his own party, but then he lost his seat. There's
that was Maxime Bernier, who was a former Conservative cabinet minister under Prime Minister Harper, and then sort of created his own party that he fought in the last election. And if you spend a lot of time on like 4chan or whatever, you would have thought that this was going to be a hugely consequential party, but it got less than 1% of the vote, I believe, and it couldn't win a single seat. Maxime Bernier couldn't even hold his own seat. I believe he came in 3rd place in his own riding. So it was a complete disaster. And so, Canadians sometimes get this reputation from Americans. It's like, oh, our party system is so much better than the American party system, and any party can get elected in Canada. But it's like Canadians are pretty tribal and pretty locked into supporting their party of choice in the same way that Americans are. And I think that that's very true on the right wing in this country in particular, where there's a deep because since there's 2 left-wing parties and only 1 right-wing party, and we see, speaking from the Conservative perspective, is we see how much that split on the left helps our side. I think that there's a kind of thinking that the last thing that the conservatives want to do when they're already playing at a disadvantage is to help the left-wing parties even more by sort of splitting the vote on the right-wing side. And so I think that's why parties like Bernier's don't get any traction, even if I think on paper you could say that there's probably a lot of conservative voters that in theory agree with some of the things that Bernier is promoting. But it's that desire to avoid splitting the vote and giving any more advantage to the Liberals than they already have.
Yeah. Okay, so the next question is from the Arrived Hussars. And it says, I think he's actually like a mod of yours or something.
Yeah, my old friend.
He asks, also, what was your most radical belief compared to the mainstream Canadian Conservative Party? So I guess what's the most left thing that you think compared to I guess two ways to say it is what's your most what's an opinion that's I guess more conservative than the typical opinion of a conservative for a specific issue, and I think what's more left wing for a conservative member of the party to believe in compared to other people in the Conservative Party. So I guess what's the most conservative belief you have that's more,
Well, I guess the most sort of conservative belief I have is just I'm very radically pro integration with the US. So I really think that we should not have any protectionism at all in this country. I think that we should just compete entirely on an even playing field with the US. I don't think we should have preferential tariffs and subsidies for industry and all that. I would just get rid of that altogether and just sort of have complete sort of as much economic integration as is possible with the US. And if that, means that some uncompetitive Canadian businesses have to go under, I'm sort of prepared to be a sort of hard-nosed capitalist about that sort of thing. And that's sort of a position that conservatives don't champion. That is that's actually an issue that that Bernier himself tried to sort of triangulate with the Conservative Party. He or maybe not triangulate, but sort of tried to drive a wedge in the base, because he was very against. In fact, one of the issues that he sort of rose to fame on was being very against the dairy subsidies that we provide in this country. The Canadian dairy industry can't really compete with the American dairy industry, and so it's very heavily subsidized by the Canadian government and by preferential laws to sort of limit imports from the US and all that kind of thing. So that's, I would get rid of that. I would get rid of things like the CBC, the Canadian public broadcaster. I would basically just feel that we should have complete and utter free trade with America, no exceptions. And then an issue where I'm sort of more left-wing than I think the conservative norm would be on issues like trans rights. I mean, that's one that I always bring up a lot. Because I consider myself very supportive of trans rights and transgender people, and a lot of the Conservative Party is much like the Republican Party in the U.S. is still a party where there's a lot of very conservative Christians who hold a lot of sort of sway in the party, and even though the party is perhaps less socially conservative than the Republican Party is, it's still if you wanted to be an outspoken proponent of rights for transgender people in the context of the Conservative Party of Canada, you would still feel pretty uncomfortable, and you'd still be sort of rubbing against the grain quite a bit. So that would be an issue where, and I'm just generally a pretty secular person as well. So it's these not all of these social issues, but certainly on some of them, I'm probably more liberal than the party norm.
Yeah, I think that kind of correlates with, in a sense, where people like to say that they are socially more left, but then economically more right. Then I remember a video of yours, at least in America. Usually, when people, usually that's not exactly really true at all. I heard apparently that's the smallest group of people, the socially liberal, economically conservative types. Usually, when you are liberal, you tend to be more liberal across the board, and then you tend to be more conservative across the board. That's to the typical voter. I do think it's a bit interesting, though, when someone who is just more politically educated, that they know they have a much better idea of what they're talking about, that they can still be the reality. The thing is that most people don't really think that way because they don't really know labels.
Yeah. I mean, like, and I'm not a complete sort of stereotype as far as the economically conservative and socially liberal goes. Like, I consider myself pro-life, for instance, right? And that's like one of like the big social conservative issues in this day and age. So I'm, I mean, but I agree with what you're saying, right? Like, it is true that most people are generally much more sort of hardwired across the board than I think that you would think if you spend a lot of time talking to people that write newspaper columns or maybe have YouTube channels and things like that, where I think the fiscally conservative, socially liberal mix is a bit more common. Although I often wonder when people say that, what they mean by fiscally conservative, right? So like for example, like there's a lot of people in Canada that would say, "Oh, I'm fiscally conservative and socially liberal." But then if you ask them like, "Well, should we do any of the things that I was talking about earlier? Like, should we abolish the CBC? Should we have complete free trade with the United States in which we don't prop up any uncompetitive Canadian industries that can't compete with American competition?" A lot of people would be like, "Oh, no, 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 no." Like, so I often wonder, just how quick people are to compromise on these sorts of things. And there's been some conversation as well that like a lot more people than we realize are kind of economically liberal and socially conservative, which in some respects is kind of like the easiest quadrant of the four corners to be in, because when you can be economically liberal and socially conservative, you're basically sort of positioning that there's not really a lot of discipline in your sort of worldview, right? It's like, well, we should spend as much money as we want to give all of the good things to everybody, and also like I just want to sort of have the government reflect my sort of personal social opinions on the way things should be. Like I want to have basically like a government that's very judgmental and a bit of a busybody in sort of the social department, and also doesn't feel any obligation to run the finances in any sort of responsible way. That like the government should be able to pay for everything and judge and punish everyone. And I just kind of feel like that's like in the era of Trump, that you've had some sort of people that have acted like being socially conservative and fiscally progressive is like very principled and like this like real sort of underrated sweet spot of decency and principle that sort of like the mainstream has scorned for far too long and is now getting their time in the shine. But I disagree with that. I think that I have a lot more time for people that are either firmly ideological in one direction or another, or are the sort of much maligned socially conservative or socially liberal, fiscally conservative, assuming that they actually are in fact consistent in that way and are not just claiming to be. I think that a lot of the socially liberal, fiscally conservative are just kind of left-wing people that don't want to be on the hook for sort of fiscal irresponsibility, which is obviously not an attractive label to fix to yourself.
All right. I think the next question. Oh well, before we go on, just one thing, because about the trans rights thing.
Yeah.
I know that I'm not too educated on it, but I know like I think you're familiar with Jordan Peterson. I think they were talking about something when it came to like the way that he like kind of handled that. Like he said, I think that he would call someone, like if someone asked him, "Hey, can you call me this type of pronoun?" He would say, "Sure, I would do that." But then I think he had a problem with it being like put into a sort of like governmental like enforcement. But then people said that it was specifically for the workplace, not really like social, like everyday life, just in the workplace. Like, what do you like? I'm not too sure about that law. Can you like? Do you mind like explain it a little?
Well, I mean, I do have some problems with some of Canada's sort of hate speech laws, which was part of what was sort of expanded under the bill that I believe Jordan Peterson sort of rose to fame protesting. And I've written criticism about it in the past, just because I'm very critical of laws that are written in like a very, very sort of like expansive and open-ended way to criminalize sort of like broad forms of speech. And so the way that like, because Canada doesn't have sort of a robust First Amendment regime the way that the United States does, and sort of the Canadian Supreme Court has ruled that it is in fact acceptable to criminalize expressions of speech that expose other Canadians to forms of of sort of hatred or contempt, as this might be subjectively defined. And so as much as I consider myself like a big fan of trans rights, like on a personal level, and why I think that we as a society should embrace the existence of transgender people and should attempt in whatever way is sort of reasonable to create a society that acknowledges that some people are transgender, and that that this is just an inescapable part of human existence in the same way that dealing with homosexual people is. That being said, like I do have a problem with like inserting into the Criminal Code of Canada this just kind of like vague open-ended language that says something like exposing someone to contempt on the basis of their gender identity is a criminal offense. Like, just because the terms of that are so broad and are so vague. But I mean, I feel the same way about like having laws that say that exposing someone to contempt or hatred on the basis of their age should be a criminal offense, right? Like, that these are just sort of categories of prohibited speech that are unclear to me, and I think it's sort of not. It doesn't reflect well on Canada's commitment to, I think, basic sort of constitutional principles, that we would have this kind of language in our laws. So I guess I'm sort of in agreement on Jordan Peterson on that issue, but at the same time, I feel like a lot of the people that were protesting that law in that specific context were not really engaging with the larger question about Canada's speech laws more broadly, and whether or not we should have sort of specific prohibitions on certain types of expression. And they were more just kind of trying to like ride the kind of populist backlash to the transgender acceptance phenomenon more broadly, right? Which is to sort of suggest that this is this really sort of like unreasonable destabilization of society that sort of the progressives are pushing, and that we need to fight back against it, because pretty soon we're all going to be thrown in jail for, misgendering people and stuff like that. Like, I think like that there was a bit of a moral panic sort of that was sort of built around the sort of the Jordan Peterson, that particular sort of Jordan Peterson crusade, that I was not super into at the time it was happening. But when it comes to sort of writing laws that are essentially designed to criminalize people's people who are insulted or hurt or exposed to forms of contempt or bigotry, like I'm not really a big fan of laws of that sort.
All right. Let's see. The next question. I think the next two ones are more like joke questions, but does JJ think the brain drain of 2/3 software engineers is serious?
So I guess that we're talking about sort of the migration of Canadian tech workers to the US, right? I've heard it said that there's something like 600,000 Canadians in Silicon Valley alone. Like, it's incredible, the numbers. But it doesn't bother me, because, like I said, like my position, my hardline fiscally conservative position, is just that Canada and the US should be economically integrated. Like, we should think about North America as a single sort of economic unit, rather than as two arbitrarily divided ones. And so I think that the tech industry of this continent exists in America. It exists particularly in California. And I think that that's fine. I think that that's just the economic reality of this continent. And one thing that I'm very opposed to is this idea of like feeling deeply insecure and uncomfortable with the fact that America has certain vibrant industries that Canada doesn't, which then sort of creates a political incentive for Ottawa to, subsidize the creation of these sort of phony baloney attempts to emulate something that America is doing so much better, right? Like the idea that we're going to create, Silicon Valley North, quote unquote, like we'll give enough money to Ottawa or to Vancouver or something, and they'll be able to create this kind of like phony simulation of something that's already being sufficiently addressed by America. It's the same thing with like something like Hollywood, right? It's like Canada doesn't need its own film industry. The film industry, we have a North American film industry that's based out of California, out of America. Countries, I think, as a matter of economic principle, should focus on what their competitive advantage is and not sort of create redundancy. And I think that if we thought of ourselves more as North Americans, I think that this kind of stuff would be far less troubling to us because, we all ultimately benefit from the same technology, right? It's not like that. It's not like that American technological advancements, which are often, made by Canadians, would not be shared with the Canadian people themselves. I think a lot of this is just driven by a sort of sense of patriotic insecurity, and presumably as well by government desires to get their own cut of the sort of the sweet revenue that these sort of vibrant industries produce. But it's like the same thing. It's like like we would never say that Canada is like failing in some deep moral way because we don't have like a vibrant sugarcane industry, right? For instance, right? So I different parts of the world will be better at producing different things, and I think that this is a sort of old-fashioned economic argument to make, but competitive advantage is a real thing, and it's important to realize what your competitive advantages are and aren't.
Okay. Let me see here. By the way, that question was asked by. Let me just make sure. That question was asked by Sibi16 or Sibiliel 16 Sigma. The next question is from Captain Tom. He asks, JJ, the folks on the official JJ Discord are refusing to give Catholics a roll color. Hashtag give Catholics a roll color. I think this is indicative of a much larger issue on inclusivity and discrimination. What is your opinion on religious discrimination? And do you think we need to do more to prevent digital discrimination?
What is a roll call?
I think it's a Catholic one in your server. Like I think half of the question is kind of a joke. Like, oh, like they're just refusing to give a separate color for the Catholic role in your server, like the JJ server, but he acts like an actual like legitimate question, which is, like, what is your opinion on religious discrimination, and do you think we need to do more to prevent, I guess, digital discrimination in general?
I don't know if I have a very strong opinion on that. It is funny to me how like some people are sort of becoming more ostentatious about their religious identities online. I think that it's partly just like the fact that internet seems to really encourage the development of narrower and narrower communities. And so, for instance, if you spend a lot of time on social media, particularly sort of like in conservative social media, you'd suddenly be under the impression that there's been this huge upsurge and like these radical fundamentalist Catholics all over the place, because they're a lot more out and proud and aggressive in proselytizing. Well, not even proselytizing, but just sort of, sharing their own memes and sharing their own articles and sort of broadcasting what they are and how they're very different and distinctive and all this kind of thing. So, I mean, I don't know if that remotely engages with the question, but it is interesting to me just like how the internet allows just kind of a strengthening of almost any kind of identity you could imagine through the fostering of communities of sort of small groups of people who might otherwise not be aware of each other's existence offline. And I suppose that like as different communities become more organized and thus more visible, that can provoke a sort of backlash. People are discovering new bigotries that they never perhaps knew that they had until they were exposed to communities that they never knew existed.
Yeah, I do think that is something to really consider, that because of there being more of like an exchange of ideas alongside that is of course religion. Yeah, I also do you though think, just to add on to this question before going on to the next one, do you think that the spread of information in a way, because of how much there is, do you think it just naturally has a, not a bias, but a more a higher ground for things like agnosticism or atheism or just theism in general, just like an uncertainty of faith? Do you think that there's some sort of stronger argument when you put all different types of religions onto the discussion, or just the or beliefs in them in general?
Oh yeah, I think so. I think that's actually a very good way of putting it. And I personally I feel like that's my own sort of opinion on religion and stuff these days. Is I feel like as I've become more aware of the diversity of religions in the world, in part because of my exposure to them online, I just feel like that is in some ways the strongest argument against dogmatism in any particular faith. just because there are so many different religious traditions and there are so many different groups of people who believe deeply that their faith is the correct one, and their evidence is not much stronger than any other rival faith. It's just that they've grown up in a particular faith community and a particular part of the world or what have you. And I think that all of these claims that the different faiths of the world make are all mutually exclusive, but they're all mutually confident, right? And so I think it's very you as sort of like once you become aware of like the diversity of faith traditions that exist, I think that it just makes religion seem much more like a kind of man's creation, as opposed to something where you can really sort of see the hand of the divine in it. Like you can see the hand of the divine, I suppose, in the fact that religion exists as a part of human civilization. Like it seems to be one of like the base inescapable sort of cornerstones of civilization, is that we all sort of crave some sort of connection with a higher power. But the idea that like these very hyper specific churches that sort of exist in different cultures and communities around the world, the idea that you can make a persuasive argument that church X or faith Y is the one objective true faith that can be proven in any sort of empirical way, I just find like you can't look around the world and see such an abundance of different faith traditions and conclude that these are anything but things that humans have made for their own very particular reasons, as opposed to things that have been sort of that have been discovered by man on their own.
Yeah. That's I think that's a really just good discussion to have overall. But we got to go on to the next question. The next question is from VFSDM, a colleague. I know this guy. He's from your server. He was here last time for the other AMA. Greta Thunberg, thoughts?
I don't know. I'm not super like plugged into climate change as an issue. I mean, I think it's important, but it certainly hasn't been one that I've spent a lot of time in part because like I identify with a sort of conservative tradition, and conservatives, for good or for ill, have just not really considered this issue to be a very sort of front of mind issue of importance. I'm quite possibly at their own peril, both sort of like electorally and sort of morally. I think that I'm prepared to accept that that's a fair critique of sort of the right wing. Greta in particular, I mean, I suppose I'm just sort of instinctively skeptical of the idea of elevating young people of that age to an exalted role in the political discourse. But I think that it's a very common phenomenon that goes back further than a lot of people realize. I was reading the other day about that there was this young girl, I forget what her name was, but like she was this young American girl who had like become this international celebrity because she was very committed to the idea in the 1980s that there should be peace between the Soviet Union and the US, basically like end the Cold War. And that she flew to the Soviet Union and was like given like a hero's welcome and paraded all over the place. And she would sort of say like very earnest things like, I just don't want there to be nuclear war. And I think that the children of today want there to be peace between the superpowers and all this kind of stuff, right? And, she was very dismissed. And like a lot of people said, oh, this is like very maudlin. And like the right wing was very angry at her and said, oh, she's a dupe and naive, very much the same sort of things that are said about Greta today. So, and as well, that then when the right wingers would criticize, they would say, oh, how dare you criticize a child? She's so innocent and at least her heart is in the right place, even if she doesn't have all the facts right, and yada, yada, yada. I mean, I just don't think that there's much to be gained by having children play a big role in the political discourse. I don't care how precocious they are. It's very difficult to argue with a child. It's very hard to talk about politics in the kind of harsh adult way that I think most of us are accustomed to talking about politics when children become sort of involved in those discussions. So, I mean, to the extent I think anything about Greta, it's probably thoughts on those grounds. I mean, this is not engaging at all with any of the particulars of the arguments she makes or doesn't make. I'm just sort of talking about what it's like when children are involved in the political discourse, and how it's, I don't think, generally something that's improves the discourse.
Yeah, I do think though that the way that Greta has been treated, at least by some people in the right wing, has been a little bit cruel. I think because you're giving a lot of like, especially with someone as famous as her, you have a lot already, a lot of pressure coming towards you because you're not just a celebrity, or you're not just a known figure to people, but you are also someone who's very young and is still understanding the world. She's not even I think she just turned 17.
Yeah.
Wasn't there like an oil company in Canada that made a logo of Greta, but like it was in a very provocative way? I think
Uh,
I don't want to say it like in here because like, we're recording and the YouTube, but if anyone wants to see it, there like you can look up Canadian like a Canadian company like Greta Thunberg, and it's like essentially uh like something going on with her in there that it's not something that would be appropriate for uh like a
oh
17
yeah,
year
I
old.
see this now. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
No, that's very obscene. No, I mean it's obscene and it's indefensible, right? And there's been a lot of obscene and indefensible things sort of said and done in response to her. And people that do those kind of vile things to at the expense of a child, are indefensible, and they deserve to be held accountable for what they do. I mean, but you also have to say that the world of politics is a terrible world, and it's awful. And I mean, it's one reason why I often sort of second guess my involvement in it, because the levels of hate and cruelty are so high. So then, like, you just kind of have to say, like, is this really a realm for young people to get involved in? People that are teenagers or even younger. I mean, there's been attempts to make pundits of people who are even younger than Greta. And so I would just kind of say that, like, for both the good of the kids and the good of all of us, like, it doesn't sort of strike me as that this is a path that we should go down. In part because, like, it seems that we are just, I mean, like, it's because the blame is not on the child necessarily. A lot of the blame is just on us adults, that we're not emotionally equipped to deal with the reality of having a child in our midst in this kind of thing, just because, like, our preferred language of politics has just become so crude and so vile and so mean spirited. So that's kind of what I was meaning when I'm sort of saying that why I think we should second guess the involvement of kids.
yeah. Um, Let me see here. And then he also asks, but by the way, if I'll like give like a maximum of like two questions, but like then after, if I see more of people like as same people asking, I'm gonna skip over. If we have time, we'll go over them again. But this one I think is important. Uh, what do you think about the 2003 Iraq invasion and the war in Afghanistan? Is America really oil/petrol philic as they are being accused?
Well, the Iraq War was a very big issue for me when I was growing up. I was in college, and it was one of, like, the very first issues that I really sort of felt strongly about. And same with 9/11 and the Afghanistan war. And I was very pro-war. I was very supportive of the Bush administration. And so, I mean, like, now I think that most of us are like, those wars have very few defenders on either the right or the left. I mean, they've gone on for so long, and that they seem, well, I mean, the Iraq War is basically wound down at this point, but the Afghanistan War is wound down as well. But like, we're still in. I mean, America is still engaged in some capacity in both of those countries, and I think that the way that these conflicts have stretched on for for close to 2 decades now, and the idea that there was never a clear end point, I think, is sort of the lesson that has to be drawn from that. Is that I'm not, military engagement is not, like, I'm not an isolationist. I'm not somebody that's of the persuasion that the lesson from Afghanistan and Iraq is that war is bad all of the time, and that there's never an intervention into another country that could ever be justified. Like, I think that that's really overreading the lesson, and it's also kind of like retreating into a very sort of like easy, simplistic answer, which is, I think, what pacifists often, I think that's what pacifism is all about. It's creating a sort of an easy, morally righteous escape from the difficulties of foreign policy. But I mean, I think it has to be said that those of us who supported the wars enthusiastically were quite naive about what we believed the military solution could affect on its own. I think that there was a sort of thinking, and I mean, it seems very naive, as I said, and preposterous in retrospect. But I think there really was a belief at the time that that the invasion of Iraq and the invasion of Afghanistan were going to lead to like very, very profound, rapid cultural change in those countries, that were going to make them these like vibrant democratic societies that were going to be like internally peaceful and organized, and by virtue of their success, terrorism would be less of a threat because we'd be removing the breeding ground of terrorism, and yada yada yada. And there was a sort of, this was kind of like an overly reductive theory about what was wrong with those cultures, or those countries in the first place, which was, as we know now, I think was much more about much more than just the fact that they had these repressive governments. That in some ways, the repressive governments were much more a product of the dysfunctions of those countries rather than the cause of it, right? And I mean, in terms of the business about the oil, though, I've always thought that was a very sort of preposterous argument. Like, there is not, like at the time, people like Michael Moore were running around and saying that like the only reason why America is in Afghanistan and Iraq is for like oil related reasons. Like in some cases that like you would hear them speak and you think that like America was literally like going to oil with, or going to Iraq with a bunch of like empty barrels and just like filling them up and then taking it back to America, right? But like when you actually look at the history of the oil industry during the war, like it is not at all clear that, I mean, even now, it's not at all clear that America is living in some sort of golden era of low oil prices and all the rest of it because of the Iraq war. Like the way that the Iraqi constitution was written, and like the benefits that were given to the Iraqi government in terms of the amount of oil revenue that they were able to keep for themselves, and the role that the Iraqi government has in dictating oil contracts and all of this kind of thing. Like it's a much more complex and nuanced thing. And as well, when you actually look at the stated motivations and even the unstated motivations of the people that were organizing the wars at the time, like there doesn't seem to be very much supporting evidence at all that oil was a sort of front of mind consideration. People like George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and sort of the people in their orbit were very convinced about the sort of naive theory that I posited earlier, that intervention was necessary because this was in some way going to attack Islamic terrorism at its assumed root, which was assumed to be rooted in these dictatorial regimes, and that these countries didn't really have any underlying dysfunctions beyond that they were ruled by dictators, and thus once you got rid of the dictator, everything would be hunky dory, and that all of this kind of stuff that we now see defining the reality in those countries, sectarian and ethnic tension, and and sort of persistent economic problems and this sort of thing. There was a real sort of minimization of the seriousnesses of those threats. And just one final thing, though, that I would say is that I think that the left wing should not be too smug or too proud about the fact that they oppose these wars, because I think that the reasons why they oppose them were reasons that haven't aged particularly well either, whether or not it's this like no blood for oil kind of stuff, or if it's stuff like that the fundamental problem with the Iraq war was that it didn't have UN approval, right? Like I think that the left wing did not have an overly sophisticated critique of the war beyond the fact that they just didn't like war, they didn't like George W. Bush, they bought into these oil conspiracy theories, or that they were overly deferential to the United Nations. I think that there was nobody on either side really understood the challenges of those countries, because in part we didn't want to underestimate those countries' capacities for something better. Nobody wanted to be on the side saying that, like, oh, the Iraqis can't handle democracy and it'll just provoke this horrible civil war because, they ultimately will just, resume their ancient religious hatreds and this kind of thing. Like, nobody wanted to be on the side of that argument. And that's why I think that you didn't hear that argument made very often at the time.
Yeah. I mean, I do think overall, most people in hindsight looked at Iraq and then realized that, very similar to Vietnam, that when you go into war, it's not just what the goal is, but it's also the consequences of what happens after that. And I think that's
Hmm.
something that the Bush administration and people who supported the Iraq War initially, like the entire mass media, supported that, and there was no like real questions of what are the consequences of taking down Saddam Hussein. What is there next after Saddam Hussein? Will there be any other enemies or types of things happening in Iraq? It was also like it's also pretty unpopular to state that well, we don't really care because the threat's gone, and America and the Western powers still have a big influence, and that's what really matters. At the end of the day, I think that's a very, I think, almost unpopular thing to say. To say, well, I don't really care that 200,000 Iraqis died. Like when you say stuff like that, then it's like, okay, so what's your standard of good then? Because it's a completely different one compared to others. But
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to say because it's like at the time George W. Bush and the Bush administration was being hammered endlessly, in part because of like these theories about the oil and all of that, that they were sort of like these neo-imperialists who were like looking to like colonize the Middle East and make them, you know, subordinate to American power and all this kind of stuff. And like that being the context, I think like that was a very difficult context in which the Bush administration could make like a vigorous defense of what was going to happen after the war, right? Like it was not a good context in which to sort of like make a robust argument about like, okay, well, we're going to occupy Iraq for, you know, like this many years and we're going to restructure their society in this way and we'll do that and we won't allow this guy to get elected if that happens. And like the kind of stuff that you would have to do if you were very serious about rebuilding the societies in a way that it was often suggested they needed to be rebuilt. You know, when we, after the Second World War, for instance, we engaged in, you know, for lack of a better term, meddling in German and Japanese politics at a level that I just think no one would tolerate today because we have a much more sort of a much more sort of like a broadly anti-imperialist culture in general, in which we sort of believe that every country has a fundamental right to self-determination, and and I think this also comes in the context of the Vietnam War as well, and that like we have a limited capacity to sort of like dictate the terms of any country's system of government or any country's sort of political culture, and so as much as people often say that like that there was no sort of follow through. And I think that that's fair. I think that's the correct criticism to make. I just wonder, like, in retrospect, if we had to do all of this over again, if there was a way to have made an argument in favor of a better occupation that wouldn't have just immediately been dismissed as the Bush administration having, these like very sinister colonial argument or visions on designs on Iraq.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in pretty much of agreement with how like Iraq was like how bad it was conducted and such. I think most people do. The next question is from Daifi Makku Oloda. My God, you people have terrible names. No, I'm kidding. But like, all right, but what they're asking is they also use the Irish flag. What is your?
I know this person.
Sorry.
No, I know who you're talking about.
Oh, okay. How do you pronounce it?
You're all my Discord friends, yes.
How do you pronounce it?
I don't know.
Oh, okay. Well, that sounds like, oh, geez, okay. Their question is, what is your opinion on universal healthcare? It's a pretty straightforward question.
Well, I mean, I think universal healthcare is a goal. Universal healthcare is not a program. There is not one magical idea that exists that is just called universal healthcare and you either have it or you don't. Like universal healthcare is a policy objective rather than a policy. And there's lots of different ways that you can have universal healthcare. I mean, like one of the things, like, by many measures, America right now has something close to universal healthcare in the sense that the vast, vast majority of Americans do have some form of healthcare coverage, right? It's not identical. Like Americans get their healthcare coverage in any number of different ways, and America is a sort of patchwork system of many different levels of coverage. But most Americans do have some degree of coverage, so you can say that America has something close to the approximation of universal coverage. But I think that when we talk about healthcare policy, there kind of has to be a goal that goes beyond merely sort of universality, right? Like it has to be the idea that people are satisfied with the quality of care that they have, that the quality of care is sufficient to meet their medical needs and that sort of thing. And so, I mean, like, I think that universal coverage, universal healthcare is a worthy goal of any government. But that is not to say that the only path to get there is some sort of system like what Canada has, which is a very extreme end of the spectrum. It's often sort of said that Canada and the US are like two very extreme poles. Canada's approach to universal healthcare is even more extreme than many countries we think of as being very left-wing in Europe, for instance. In Canada, the idea is that all health insurance must be provided by the government and no one else, and that there must be, that the existence of private clinics and hospitals must be deeply discouraged, if not outright prohibited, and that there must be no competition in the insurance industry beyond that which the government decides is not medically necessary. So, yeah, like I just think that when Canadians at least talk about universal healthcare, we talk about it as meaning something that I don't think it has to mean, and something that I don't think it should mean.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, however, with America, just to add, to, I guess, in a sense, almost rebuttal, in America, the thing with it is that a lot of people have their health insurance linked with their employment. The unemployment rate in America is around like the 20s, I think, or it's like 21. Like when you look at the U6 unemployment, when you're like counting for people who are underemployed or overqualified for their job. Like I think like 40 million Americans have lost their health insurance because they got let go of a job because of the virus. I do think I do think that's a big difference. Like in a lot of countries, they say, especially Western European and Canada and Australia, New Zealand, and others, they say, well, you don't need to be employed at the current moment to get health care, in the sense of you don't have to get charged massive amounts of money. In America, though, that's different. If you're like let's say, for example, you have your health insurance that's specifically for New York State, you're in California, you're not going to get covered. You have to pay out of pocket. I think that's really the main discussion on whether or not, like, the circumstances that are around. Like people say, well, should you be employed? You have to be employed. You have to be in your own state. Stuff like that. I think that's the real big conversation.
No, I think that all of those points are perfectly fine. I mean, I think that there's a lot of positive virtues to the employer-based model, but there certainly is a ton of deficiencies to it as well. Like you sort of said, if you're in any sort of unemployment situation, then obviously you're screwed. I mean, that's why I tend to think that like the most efficient and ideal path to universal coverage is some mix of private and public sector, which is what you have in Europe, where you have, I mean, a lot of Europeans get employer benefits through their employer-based health insurance as well. But then there also is a sort of robust public health insurance system that exists for people that can't get access that way. And so that when people are unemployed, or when people, have really crummy jobs or things like that, there is some sort of, like, what in American public discourse is now sort of called the public option, that allows that sort of allows affordable health care to be accessed by people that that fall outside of the narrow sort of employer-based system. I mean, but this is the problem, right? Is that in Canada, in the context of Canada, there is no public option. There's only the public, public is mandatory, basically. And I think that has created problems of its own in Canada relating to over, what do you call it? Like relating to rationing that is born from overuse of a system that doesn't have, that can't, by nature of what it is, sort of clear guardrails to protect it against overuse or things like that. So I think, as I get older and I think about this issue more, I do think that like healthcare policy is ultimately something that has to be evaluated in a sort of pragmatic, moderate way, and not be dictated by abstract ideological considerations, which I think in both Canada and the US have far too much sway in the conversation.
Mm-hmm. All right. The next question is Forak. Is from Forak. What's your opinion on Ingsoc as an ideology?
Ingsoc. So Ingsoc is was the ideology of the government in George Orwell's novel 1984. It was short for English socialism, and it obviously created a hideous totalitarian nightmare society where people were being tortured with rats and in room 101 and all this sort of thing. So yeah, no, I'm against Ingsoc. It doesn't seem like 1984 really does a good job of presenting it in any sort of favorable light.
Jeez. Yeah, I don't really think there's too much on it to discuss about. I think most sensible people would look at it and say, yeah. I don't know if necessarily that's the best. So I'm not saying it's terrible. There's
Yeah.
other ones out there that are worse. But.
I'm sure it has its defenders somewhere.
Oh yeah, 100%. But I don't think that any of them are here. I hope. But the next question is from Revolutionary Neptune, and he asks, "What is your more broad opinion on Arizona?" Phoenix is in Arizona. Arizona, Phoenix, and the Southwest. Did you enjoy your time in Phoenix? What do you think about the politics, or Arizona as a whole? I think, or Southwest.
Well, I really like Arizona. I would really like to go back there again. Being from Canada, I have a bias towards warm states, warm cities. Phoenix was truly one of the hottest places I've ever been in my life. The idea that like even when you're in the shadows, it's still like scorching hot. I remember seeing
Probably dry too, right?
Oh yeah. And I remember there was like there's scorpions like in the parking lot and just crazy stuff like that.
That's
like
insane. That's crazy. I mean, it's like a desert. That's essentially what it like.
It is. It was the one thing that really struck me about Phoenix as well is that like people forget like how sort of like newly settled Arizona is and like what a new state it is comparatively speaking. And just when I was in Phoenix, it's just striking. Like everything is like so well organized, like the streets and the districts and the neighborhoods, like everything is like on a grid and everything is like very logically spread out. And like you don't go. It's like when you're back east, everything's so ancient and you like the roads were dictated by like people's carriage routes and stuff like that. Whereas in like these new glamorous states like Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, places like this, it's just you sort of see what it's like to be in a much more sort of planned society that I guess was largely built in like the 19th century, right? And so like that was pretty cool. I mean, Arizona's politics, to the extent I have anything sort of insightful to say about it, is that Arizona really does sort of seem like a state that is sort of struggling to decide its sort of political identity. Like it does sort of seem like it's like the quintessential kind of purple state where you have a right wing that is very right wing and it has sort of been on the leading front of some of the movements that we've seen sort of coming to define Trumpism, in sense of immigration restrictionism and sort of the nationalist kind of impulses of that sort. But then you also have like it is also a very diverse society. It's I think one of several states where whites are not in the majority, and a very large Hispanic population, large population of immigrants from all over the world, and that has sort of led to a kind of cosmopolitanism and a desire to sort of rebel against the right wing, which is sort of seen as being on the forces of intolerance and a sort of like narrower conception of Americanism. And so it'll be interesting to sort of see how this all plays out in the 2019 election. Or in the 2020 election. It's seen as a state increasingly that was sort of seen as drifting Republican or drifting into becoming sort of like a solid red state, but now is sort of seen both at the presidential level and at the Senate level as being a sort of much more state that's sort of up for grabs. And so I'm sort of curious to sort of see how all of that plays out.
I mean, there's a lot to talk about with Arizona that I know of, like the population, but not only and the senatorial. Like they have a Democratic senator now, and they have the Republican who lost to her, and she's there, but she's up for a special election in a way. But Mark Kelly's going to probably win, and there's Trump, and like a lot of things is with Arizona. I think Arizona is a very underrated state. I think people will. I think eventually, when people want to go to more of these. I think the Southwest is going to be very similar to the Northeast in a way, where it's just, I think it will become more liberal over time because just what happens to cities that states that become much bigger in population and such. But not only
Yes.
that, I think it'll just be more like a warmer Northeast in a way. With if it keeps going on these trends because of Hispanic population rising, just overall, you
It's
know.
it's kind of funny, because it's like you see this a lot with sort of like Texas as well. Is that a lot of these sort of Republican governed states, they get really excited because they're like, oh, our economic policies are doing so well that people are like leaving California or New York to move to the South or to the to these sorts of places, and it's like that might give them a good talking point in the short term. But the thing you have to think about is that the people that are moving there are like people that are coming from blue states, right? So like as much as people make a big deal about immigration as being sort of this transformative force in American politics, internal migration has a role to play as well. And that if these states sort of get an influx of sort of progressive people from elsewhere in America, that could have a political impact too. Although I think what you're saying as well is kind of like the more important point is just that I mean, America is a very urban country, right? And as its urban centers become larger and more dominant in every state, like as every state increasingly becomes defined by its 2 or 3 big cities, that has political consequences as well. That sort of you get states that are themselves like less internally competitive because the population centers just become so dominant that basically as Phoenix votes or whatever, so votes the entirety of the state. I think that's been sort of a phenomenon all over North America in general, and that's why there's a lot of anxiety about sort of the right wing parties, which is there's a kind of thinking that they're not only are they sort of tied to older people, white people, people that are sort of being demographically becoming a smaller share of the electorate, but then you also have to deal with the fact that rural communities are becoming a smaller share of the electorate too, and sort of an increasingly urbanizing society is a society that is generally a more progressive one, and that's a real challenge for conservatives.
Yeah. On to the next question. By the way, yeah, the next question is actually a little similar in terms of travel, but you've mentioned you're interested in the Balkans slash visiting the Balkans. What are your thoughts about this part of the world more generally? This is from Soulless Ginger, and they're from Bulgaria.
Yeah. I mean, the Balkans are, I mean, my sort of standard answer of this is that I've spent a lot of time in Western Europe. I've been to most of the major Western European countries. And I've often felt like I would just like to see another side of Europe. I would like to see a side of Europe that is a little bit less materially wealthy and thus is probably a little bit more culturally alien to me, just in terms of the quality of life and sort of like the just the sort of the material side of things. And then as well, like the culture of the Balkans and the culture of sort of Eastern Central Europe, however you want to define it, is in some ways a more sort of traditionalistic culture from what I understand. And that would be sort of interesting to observe too. I mean, I don't really have a lot of sympathy for sort of like the nationalisms of that part of the world, which I think have caused a lot of problems politically for those places and those people. So I'm certainly like not romantic or sentimental about it at all, but I still think it would be sort of interesting to see how that manifests on the ground, to just sort of see what it's like to be in a poorer and, in some ways sort of like more old-fashioned, more sort of traditionalistic European society compared to the societies where I've been in Western Europe, which are very, very modern, very cosmopolitan, very progressive, very, urban. So it's just, I mean, when I travel as I get older, my desire is less for traveling for the sake of novelty, which is I sort of think what you do when you're young. It's just like anywhere you travel is by definition somewhere new and exciting and different because it is different. Whereas now my desire to travel is a desire to like consciously expose myself to things that I haven't been exposed to previously, like in a more substantial level. Like I'm not looking for just any old novelty. I'm looking at, like, in this case, like I would like to see how sort of like the less developed, less wealthy part of Europe lives, because I've already seen how the wealthy part of Europe lives. So yeah, that's basically what I'm thinking and what I would like to see when it comes to the Balkans once travel is again permitted.
Yeah, I do think that like it's more interesting in that regard. But some parts of not the Balkans are have become more westernized, and I think Croatia is probably one of the more developed parts of the Balkans. I
Yeah.
believe. I
Yeah, I
think
mean,
it's
this is why, like, I often think that I'd like to go to to Serbia or Montenegro or places like that, or Kosovo, or like those parts of the world.
yeah. I think it'd be good for videos. Let's see. The next question is uh his name is I have no username, boys, and his question is, what are your thoughts on Donald Trump's response to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Jeez, I mean, it's so hard to say. I mean, this is obviously like the very hot issue of the moment, but I honestly don't really have political hot takes on COVID. And in fact, I'm like purposely trying to be somewhat, you know, modest about my ability to sort of second guess what the politicians are or aren't doing, because it just really seems like the facts are changing so quickly, and a lot of people are passing judgment in a very sort of like ignorant way about sort of variables that they kind of half understand the relevance of. You know, like there was a big thing about how, you know, like that Florida, the government of Florida was being very harshly judged early in the days because it sort of seemed like they were doing everything wrong. And, you know, they have a very controversial Republican governor there that was very sort of fashionable to hate on. But now it seems like Florida is actually not doing so bad, comparatively speaking. And because, you know, a lot of our understanding of what matters and what doesn't in managing this pandemic continues to be very fluid and changes from day to day and week to week. So, I mean, I think that, like, you know, President Trump is himself, and he's obviously like, you know, he does his routine, and it's often like really uninspiring and off-putting. And these press conferences that he does, and these kind of like free association rambles that he engages in are not, you know, are not compelling to me, and I don't think make him look good at all. And I think that are like deeply counterproductive if he's at all concerned with turning this into any sort of you know, issue that he can run on. But that being said, like in terms of what his government is pushing, like, you know, right now his government is very much associated with like this idea that we're very pro opening things up, and that, like, you know, opening things up is better than keeping them closed indefinitely, and like we're going to sort of throw our chips in on that side. It's like, well, I don't know, like that's a controversial position to be taking, but I just don't feel like I'm informed enough to be able to pass judgment on to whether or not that's actually a terrible idea or a good idea. Again, just because I feel like the conventional wisdom of this whole pandemic has just been so fluid over such a short period of time that I don't want to really stake out an ignorant position and really state firm things on the basis of just kind of like what I vaguely feel to be right, or what I feel like I've sort of seen other people sort of positing that they believe is the case. Just because it's a very highly technical issue that involves a lot of issues that frankly I just am not remotely an expert in, like, you know, dealing with a viral pandemic. Like, it is not at all my wheelhouse. I'm just a political commentator, so all I can do is judge the political context. And I think like the political context right now is that there's an enormous amount of ignorance that is being weaponized in order to pass judgment on political enemies. And yeah, I'm choosing to sort of like abstain from that.
I mean, I could see that. I can understand why. You know, because of how much information, like different amounts of exchange, or just the overall like atmosphere and the circumstances. I think it's a bit overly complicated. I don't think people fully understand the situation yet, really, or the consequences. But yeah.
I mean, like, and it's like like I'm perfectly prepared to accept the premise that when all of this is cleared, like Trump has been a disaster and has been doing everything wrong. But I just kind of think like to state that with such confidence now, when we're still right in the midst of all of it, I just think is a bit premature.
Right. Yeah, that's understandable. The next question is from General Goat, and he asks, do you think that the U.S. or the UN should intervene with the situation in Hong Kong? With the return of the protests as such, I'm interested in your answer. If you didn't pass on this question, well, we're up to this question. So, yeah, what do you think?
Well, I mean, like I obviously I sympathize with the plight of the people of Hong Kong and the protesters and their desires to maintain their autonomy from mainland China and the Chinese regime. But I don't think that intervention is the right answer, just because like the stakes are so high. Because China is a massive, powerful nation. They've got a very I think we have an incentive to stay on good terms with them and do nothing that would result in any sort of like escalation of tensions between the West and the Chinese, in a way that like I think like there's a lot we can do to sort of curb Chinese power internationally, but Hong Kong is part of China, and the last thing that we would ever tolerate is the Chinese intervening in our domestic issues aggressively or assertively. And I think the Chinese would be right to be terribly offended if we tried to do something like that in the case of Hong Kong. So
Yeah.
I think that we can pass judgment, we can use the bully pulpit, we can do subtle things to signal our support, but I don't think that there'd be much to be gained. In fact, I think it would probably be deeply counterproductive if we were to try to like instigate any sort of like escalation that would come from being seen as being overtly engaging in it. I don't even know what intervention would mean. Like, I mean, are we going to like? We're not going to invade Hong Kong, but I also think we should be like,
I'm like, that would be.
I
think that'd be a terrible idea, just to invade a country and we have them as well. It's a terrible idea.
Well, but it's like, but it goes beyond that too. It's like, well, we shouldn't be like, I don't know, like giving them weapons or things like that. Like, no, it's not. Like it's part of China, and it's like you can pass judgment on what the Chinese are doing and use this as an illustration of why it's important to resist the expansion of that regime and that sort of governing ideology. But it's in the same way that like even during the height of the Cold War, people would never suggest that we should just like intervene in Russian affairs, right? Like you fight them in proxy wars. Well, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think people. I think overall, like when people say intervention, they usually mean military. But
yeah.
But I think overall, like I think most people would agree that the consequence, like look how we did Iraq. Can you imagine how we would do China? Like that would be a terror. Like, or Hong Kong, because that is in China. Like that would be, I think, potentially disastrous. That could be almost world-ending if you were to invade another country like that.
Yeah.
But the next question is from Bruh. By the way, we're just trying to go through. I'm trying to like add things as well and stuff. We want to, go into detail when we want to do this, but for the people who are like wondering, we're gonna try to get through all the questions, but some we're gonna talk about a little bit more. But the next question is from Bruh. And he asked, do you think that the breakup of the UK is possible, considering that Scotland and the Northern Ireland voted to stay in the EU?
I mean, I don't like. I think that the Scottish situation is not something to keep too much of an eye on. I mean, I'm not an expert in sort of UK internal politics, but I get the impression that sort of Scottish nationalism is kind of roughly analogous to like French Canadian nationalism in Canada, where it's like it's something that's like very politically fashionable to sort of say you're on the side of, and it is a very dominant force in the internal politics of that particular region. But it's not something that is likely to happen anytime soon, just because like the logistical difficulties of making a sovereign Scotland a reality are so daunting, and then as well like just what exactly the material benefits would be for the Scottish people as opposed to just the kind of like soft kind of patriotic cultural satisfaction that this goal is seen to embody. So then you sort of have a political culture in which sort of like just being in favor of Scottish nationalism in this kind of like abstract way becomes something that's politically useful and perhaps politically sustainable for decades, as it was in French Canada, but doesn't really ever go anywhere. But Irish, like the independence of Northern Ireland, is I think a more interesting issue, just because I was in Northern Ireland a while ago, and like the thing that everybody talks about is just how demographically that society is changing so rapidly. That sort of the Protestant community there is declining. The Catholic community is increasing, but also just that people are much less interested in the idea of Northern Irish society being forever defined by this kind of sectarian conflict, or the question of is Northern Ireland part of Britain or part of the Republic, as being like this like very emotionally heated and polarizing, and a question with generations of blood spilt in the defense of one side or the other. And I think that what a lot of people will tell you is that Northern Ireland is becoming just a much more mellow place overall, and thus that can make a question like, should we join the Republic to the south, engaged in a much more sort of like pragmatic kind of utilitarian way, in a much sort of less emotionally heated kind of way. And I think that a lot of the Brits feel the same way across the what do they call that, across the channel or across the Gulf. They just sort of see it as I think that in the wake of Brexit, for instance, and all of the difficulty that had to be exerted in order to sort of appease Northern Ireland, and how much easier things would have just been if you had one island that was just that, if all of the United Kingdom was just a single unified geographic island, the island of Great Britain, and they just didn't have to deal with the North one way or another anymore. I think that if the minority government that they had to deal with at the time, and sort of the government that Theresa May had, in which the Northern Irish Protestant Party was exerting a lot of influence over her decision making, I don't know, I think it's possible to imagine a scenario in which people would have perhaps been a little bit more comfortable in cutting Northern Ireland a bit more loose, and it may still happen. I mean, I'm curious. Once you, after having been there, it's just a very interesting society, a very fascinating place, and so yeah, I can totally see that part of the United Kingdom leaving at some point, just because I think that there's, in contrast to what I was saying about Scotland, where I think that the logistical difficulties are such that prevent it from being a very realistic goal, and thus it's a sort of more nationalistic, sort of romantic, sentimental fantasy that's keeping it going. I think the exact opposite is the case in Northern Ireland, where a lot of sort of the sentimentalism has been drained, and you just have a purely sort of logistical utilitarian argument in front of you. And I think that the utilitarian pragmatic argument for unification is quite strong.
All right. The next question is from Slovene Pepe. His question, he says, "Greetings from the tiny nation of Slovenia. Here are my questions. What little do you know about Slovenia, if anything? What's your favorite nation in Europe? And what's your opinion on Yugoslavia?" Hopefully we get through this one pretty quickly because it's 3 questions.
My favorite nation in Europe is probably Holland, where I've spent the most time. I've been to Holland about 8 times, I think, and I just love going there. It's a country I'm very fond of. I don't really know anything about Slovenia. I must apologize. I'm not very well versed in that part of the world. I think, like a lot of people from outside of it, it all kind of blurs together. Slovenia, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, all of these sorts of places. The former Yugoslavia in general, as far as my opinions on Yugoslavia go, it's pretty ill-formed and pretty informed just by generalizations and stereotypes, and it would be an interesting place to see. I mean, I do often wonder, I don't know if this is just me sort of rationalizing. I often wonder how countries maintain independent identities when they are quite small and when they are quite culturally similar to one another. And I know that in a lot of those parts of the world, they put a great deal of emphasis in trying to come up with sort of like nationalistic legends and fables and sort of myths and patriotic stuff for themselves. You know, I was talking about this a little bit in my most recent video, where I was talking about how when you go to some of these countries in sort of Eastern Central Europe, their money, for instance, often has pictures of like these medieval kings on it, and like nobody really knows what those medieval kings were like, but you know, there's kind of like this whole sort of cottage industry about presenting them as these great sort of patriotic heroes who were presided over a time in which those small countries and those small societies were very proud of who they were and like were very in control of their own destiny, and they weren't subordinate to any foreigners and all this kind of stuff. And like a lot of this stuff can be sort of revived, to go back to what like the very first question we were talking about, can sort of be revived in a kind of very nasty exclusionary way. And so like as far as like that kind of stuff is a dominant part of the culture, that's something that I kind of find a little bit worrying about that part of the world, just because like I am, like I said before, I'm pretty anti-nationalistic and certainly very unmoved by a kind of ultra sentimentalized manufactured nationalism designed to primarily give justification to sort of a modern nation state. But again, like I'm very ignorant and I don't know a lot about this part of the world beyond sort of cliches and stereotypes. So I would very much like to see it up front and see how that affects my prior assumptions.
All right. Man, there's a lot of questions when it comes to the Balkans and just Eastern Europe in general.
I don't have super strong opinions. I mean, unless you guys want to just keep hearing me.
I'm looking up. It's like, what's your opinion on the Baltics? It's like, we just covered this. But Raven asked, what is your opinion on the Israeli and Palestinian conflict? And I guess the secondary question is, would you rather live in Serbia or Bosnia? Oh my God. What does that have to do with it? Why? Okay, whatever. Let's go with the first one.
People ask me these broad, every time I do any sort of like chat thing, I always get these like hugely broad like questions. Like, man,
what's the meaning of life, JJ? Please tell me.
My opinion on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Like, I don't know. It's like it's a very serious problem that needs to be resolved in some capacity. I mean, it doesn't seem to me like I was in Israel last year, and you know, I went all over Israel, went all over the West Bank, and
you went to Tel Aviv, right? I think
I did. I went to Tel Aviv, and it's I was in Jerusalem, but you know, I was in Haifa, and I was all over the place, and I don't know, like it seems like I remember when in the sort of like at the time of like the Camp David
Accords.
Yeah, the Camp David Accords, the Oslo Accords, like all of these sorts. Am I getting that right? Was the Camp David Accords the thing I'm thinking about? The Oslo Accords probably is the thing I'm thinking about. But it was like there was in sort of like the late 90s, early 2000s, there was really sort of like a sense that Palestinian statehood was something that was, you know, more or less inevitable, that it was going to happen sooner rather than later, and that we were really just trying to sort of like iron out some of the finer details, and that this was going to be, you know, obviously it was never going to be a painless transition, but there was a kind of thinking that by that period of time, by like the early 2000s, that we had gotten as close as we had ever been, which I think is true. But now it just kind of seems like the problem seems just so much more intractable. When I was in Israel, we went to visit the Canadian ambassador to the Palestinian territories. And, you know, we spoke to him, my tour group that I was on. We spoke to the ambassador. We spoke to like some representatives of the Palestinian community. And everybody just kind of says the same thing. It's just kind of like, it really seems like a pretty dire situation. Like the Palestinian side just is really not together in a way that it needs to be. Like the Palestinians suffer from a real deficiency of leadership on the side of, like on the political side. Like they have so many internal problems of their own. They have a very just poor government. They have all of these problems with the Gaza Strip versus the West Bank, the division of jurisdiction and authority there. And of course, as well, and now you have a very hardline Israeli government as well that has really sort of demagogued very heavily on this issue and has defined itself in part in opposition to any of this talk. I was talking with a an Israeli friend of mine today, and we were talking because I did this video about like the greatest people in the world as determined by these public opinion polls. And the guy that was ranked, in 2004 or whatever, when they did the study in Israel, was Yitzhak Rabin. He was the guy that was the assassinated prime minister who was the architect of the deal with the Palestinians that created sort of like the modern day separate jurisdictions for the West Bank and Gaza. And he was at the time seen as a sort of like very heroic figure. But I was talking with my Israeli friend, and he was sort of saying that like in amongst the sort of the Netanyahu faction of Israeli society, Yitzhak Rabin is sort of seen as this like very sinister figure, like a man who sold out to the Palestinians, and I guess on some level got what was coming to him when he was murdered by a sort of Zionist extremist. And so it's like you got that sort of attitude in the driver's seat of the government of Israel now, and then you've got like a deeply dysfunctional and chaotic Palestinian situation as well. So like it's just it seems like the status quo is just going to kind of like lumber on into the indefinite future, in which neither side is really satisfied with the way things are going, but there's no leadership to prevent it from happening in any other way. So it's I think that there's like I think like Israel is a much safer society than it has been in when I was younger, and like in the time of the second infantada, if I'm pronouncing that right. It's not the infantada, it's the do you know how to pronounce that word?
I'm not entirely sure. I think I would butcher it, but I think
the infada. Oh God, I can't remember. But like the second sort of major Palestinian uprising, the time of sort of like when I was growing up, with the suicide bombs, and every day you would hear about.
Infanta, I think it's what it's pronounced. I think Infanta.
The Infanta. How do you say?
I think it's Infanta or
Infanta. I don't know. I'm getting that word mixed up in my mind with Infanta, which is like I think it's like a child of a king is the Infanta. But yeah. But no, it's like we're a long ways from the time in which sort of like stories of buses and discos getting blown up by Palestinian suicide bombers was sort of like part of the fact of life. So like in that sort of sense, like it's great that things have sort of stabilized a little bit, like that there's just less violence overall in that society. But at the same time, like, I think that the hearts are really hardening on both sides, that is preventing a sort of this peace from being a sort of peace with honor, to use a sort of Nixon type line, as opposed to just kind of like a piece of stagnation and inertia, which could then lead to all sorts of other sort of like social and political dysfunctions down the road. So, I really don't know where we're heading, other than there's not a lot of signs for encouragement. And sort of like the status quo that we're in right now might seem stable, or it might just be the eye of a storm that's yet to fully explode.
Yeah. It's just an overall like really complex issue. But the next question is from the Hound Dogger. What do you think of smaller American political parties? So I think like Libertarian and Green Party mostly.
I think that they're pointless, right? Like I think that Americans commit a sort of fallacy of analogy when they think about political parties, because Americans look at other countries and they say that those countries have more political parties than us, ergo they must have more political variety of political opinion, more diversity, and more democracy. But the thing is that the reason I think why small American political parties are so notoriously unsuccessful is not that it's not that like Americans are more closed-minded, or they sort of like are captive to this like sinister two-party duopoly that's conspiring to limit their choices and whatever. It's just that American political parties are much more internally diverse than most other political parties in the world are, and that this deeply disincentivizes the need for other parties, right? So like the idea that you can have a conservative Democrat like Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia in the same party as, AOC in New York, like, Democratic Socialist, like that is a kind of big tent that is vastly, vastly bigger than any tent you would ever see in European politics, certainly much bigger tent than you'd ever see in Canadian politics. And so I think that, like, for example, there are plenty of libertarians, self-proclaimed libertarians, in the Republican Party, just as there are democratic socialists in the Democratic Party, just as there are like more conservative, moderate Democrats, and there are more conservative and more moderate Republicans as well. I mean, I think the parties are sorting to some degree and are getting much more ideologically homogenous, but there still is a great deal of diversity. And as long as that diversity exists, and as long as that diversity can be allowed to flourish through open primaries and primary challenges and things like that, I think that like these smaller parties will never ever get traction just because they're redundant.
Yeah. I also do think, like overall, like the type of system that America's made ever since 1992, because Ross Perot actually could have became president as an independent, but dropped out
Yes.
because there was threats against his daughter, and he was scared of that. I think ever since then, both parties have kind of agreed that, okay, listen, we agree that we don't necessarily like I in most instances like each other. They do work together on some things pretty well, but on the most part they don't. And they say, but we can agree that we don't want either. We don't want a any third party in general to change an election because of that. Like we don't want anything like that because Ross Perot was very close to that.
But I mean, I think that like I'm not sure if that's entirely true. Like, I mean, I think that there are still a lot of elections for the Senate and for the House and for governors where the third party does play a significant role. I mean, it doesn't play a
Oh
significant
yeah.
role in the sense that they're on the brink of being elected, but they certainly, like, I think that there's been more than a few Senate and gubernatorial elections where you can say that the third party played a role in deciding who ultimately won.
True.
But and I the presidential level is also interesting because I mean, like, Ross Perot was Ross Perot. Like, I mean, in theory, he was head of the Reform Party, but like it was very much a movement that was just bound up in him. And then when he went away, you know, his quote unquote party went away too. So I think that like it's just a matter of whether or not people are willing to put themselves forward as somebody that would like to run for president, but for some reason or another doesn't feel like that they could make it through the primary system, right? Like this is the big sort of like weird paradox of it, right? Because since both the Republican and Democrat parties are open to anyone, and that in theory anyone could win the nomination, the argument will always be, well, why don't you just try winning one of the major party nominations and then run for president, having sort of taken over the party in the way that Donald Trump did, right? Whereas when you're running as an independent, it's sort of, you kind of, in American political culture, you come off as a bit of a, I don't know what the word would be, but like you come off as a bit of a coward, right? It's kind of like you're too timid to run in a primary, but you just kind of like expect to just waltz onto the debate stage and be on the ballot and all the rest of it without putting in any of the hard work that the two major party nominees have to go through. So, and that's why, like, I think that this sort of argument worked on Bloomberg, right? Like Michael Bloomberg had sort of long flirted with the idea of a third party presidential run, but I think that the sort of like the arrogance that would be seen if he just ran as a Michael Bloomberg as opposed to as a Democrat became like, that was a pretty strong criticism against him. And then as well, you also get into the fear of the vote splitting as well, right? Which is just sort of like, if my ideas are so important, I would rather try to fight for them within one of the parties that are quite flexible and quite open to being able to adopt my agenda, rather than just fighting for my agenda on the outside and possibly splitting the vote in weird ways that might allow the party that I hate the most to come to power.
Yeah, I just do think overall, like, yeah, with the presidential elections, of course, it's not the only thing, but even with like the Senate seats and the governor seats and House seats, like the only, like, I think two independents in the Senate are Angus King and then Bernie Sanders, and they're from states that are really friendly to third parties because of them.
Yeah.
But and even so, they've been there for like a long time. Both of them, they're not like brand new people. Like they've been there for about 2 or 3 terms or more. You know.
And I think that Angus King was also, if I recall correctly, I think Angus King was also the independent governor of his state.
Yeah.
Is he? He's from. So like, yeah, he has like and like same with Bernie Sanders, right? Like both of these men sort of like were independents before they achieved their current office. So they just kind of like leveraged their independence in their first job into their independence into their higher job in the Senate.
There's more
So,
name recognition. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. But I mean, but that can work both ways too, right? So it's like if the question is sort of like if you have people that have a high enough profile that they're willing to risk that profile by running as an independent and trying to sort of upset the political system that way.
Right. Okay. It was a really good, I think, conversation on that one. Then there's another question. Steph asks, "What do you think of the Flemish independence movement?" I sound ignorant when I say this, but Flemish, I forget. That sounds familiar, but
Flemish is what they call the sort of the Dutch speaking part of Belgium.
Yeah. Isn't there like an opposite one of like Belgium where it's for the French, like for
Yeah,
southern Belgium?
Yeah, the French, like the francophone part of Belgium is another sort of faction. I don't know. I mean, I don't have strong feelings on this. I've been to Belgium. I've been to Belgium many times, um, and they have a weird sort of tension there. It's between the French speakers and the Dutch speakers, and in some ways, it's kind of somewhat reflective of sort of like the Canadian split. It's funny, actually. One thing that was striking to me when I was in Belgium, and Belgium was in a lot of sort of political turmoil when I went there, but just like how common it was to see like politicians and media and journalism and just like ordinary Belgian people talk about their country as being this kind of like artificial thing, like this kind of like very contrived, phony society where it's like sort of we're holding together these two like distinct communities that don't really have a lot to do with each other and don't really have a lot of sort of like cross-cultural pollination in the same way that like English Canada and French Canada don't. And thus sort of like, and I mean, it's even worse than French Canada and English Canada because like there is no, like, at least you can say that Canada has national parties, like, you know, the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party and the NDP, you know, to varying degrees of success, they are competitive in both English Canada and French Canada. But in Belgium, you just have like a Liberal Party that is only for the French part of the country, and then you have a different Liberal Party that is only for the Dutch part of the country, and you have that's replicated in all the different political parties, and it just creates this like they have a political culture that is just so stratified across these sort of linguisto-ethnic lines that just makes this kind of tension like an omnipresent part of their politics and their culture and their society. And it's been difficult to create, from what I understand, it's been difficult to sort of like create a clear concept of Belgianness that is sort of transcendent of those linguistic and cultural hangups, and which are in turn like very heavily influenced by whatever culture that they're closest to, right? So it's like French Belgium is very influenced by real France, and then Dutch Belgium is really influenced by Holland. And so there's kind of like this sort of sense that these are sort of two societies that are kind of more like, you know, they're more like sort of regional deviations of those two major European countries more than that they're two parts of a coherent third thing of Belgium, right? So I don't know. That's so I mean, like, I guess the idea would be that maybe like the Dutch part should just join Holland and the French part should just join France. And I mean, I don't know, like, it's easy for me to say as an abstract outsider. That idea strikes me as maybe it makes a bit of sense, but I generally tend to like the idea that that countries that don't really have a very rational reason for existing should maybe think about you know, folding it in with countries where the identity is perhaps a little bit more solid. So I don't know, but Belgium's a lovely place. I've enjoyed being there, and they're wonderful people. And there's aspects of Belgian culture, at least that I, as a foreigner, have enjoyed engaging with.
Yeah, I mean, I probably want to go to Belgium, especially the southern part, because I speak French, but I haven't been there yet. But yeah, the next question is from Mine Short Person, and he asks, "What is your favorite type of maple syrup?" Oh my god.
Well, there's only three. There's three types of maple syrup, and recently I forget what it is. Like there's like amber, and then there's like dark, and there's like very dark. I think those are the three grades, or something like that. And anyway, my parents have recently taken to buying the very dark type, which I'd never had before. And so sometimes when I go to my parents' house, we have pancakes like good Canadians, and my father like will have the very dark syrup, and he'll make such a big fanfare. But this is all we eat now, and so I've come to enjoy it. It is dark, and it has a sort of, it's the strongest sort of maple taste, or maybe it's just like all in my imagination. But that would be my answer. Although here's another, as long as we're on the topic of maple syrup, and since I'm a Canadian, I have no shortage of opinions on this matter. As a sort of bad Canadian, though, I must say I actually sometimes do enjoy just the real cheap, like Mrs. Butterworth kind of style of crap that you buy at the supermarket. Because like I'm not the biggest fan in the world of like the maple flavor. You know, like when you have like this extra dark maple syrup, it has a very strong, very overt mapley taste. And I don't always prefer that over just having some sort of sugary goo on my pancakes. Like when I go to IHOP, I love just getting like the crazy flavors, you know, like blueberry or this like strawberry, which of course have never seen a berry in their life. They're just like these sort of like sugar goos. And I like that. Like I really do have a sweet tooth, and I often have a sweet tooth in the direction of just the taste of pure sugar and nothing else. So
Yeah, I mean, I've always just been more of like a honey person. Maple syrup's okay, but I don't know. Just I have, I guess, more of a preference with honey from myself. But yeah, the next question is it's about the Baltic states. Let's go over this in a minute. What is your opinion regarding the future of the Baltic states? They ask you these. So it's always the Baltic states. They ask you like these very like big loaded questions that like could take hours to respond.
They're just trolling at this point, I think, because they know that they made that comment about the Baltic states, and now everybody wants to see it. I see. I was wrong about the maple syrups. I forgot that there's actually a fourth category as well. There is. I said there was amber, dark, and very dark, which is true, but there's also golden, which is like the most watered down flavor. So I apologize for misleading people. The future of the Baltic states, I don't know. They're all going to join North Korea and become new provinces.
Oh my god. All right, I think that answers the guy. The guy's name's Zyphid, by the way. But yeah, anyways, the next person is Atomic Penguin. What are your thoughts on Wexit? How likely do you think it is, and how would you support it?
Wexit, I don't think is at all likely to happen because I just don't see anybody arising to lead it. I think it's just kind of like a sort of gripe that has a name. You know, Wexit in theory is the idea that the western provinces of Canada, however that's defined, which is unto itself a sort of open question, would sort of leave Canada and I guess form its own independent republic. But no, I mean, like it's not a serious idea. Like nobody has really sort of thought through what this means as a logistical basis, like how such a country would be self-sufficient and what sort of relationship it would have with the rest of Canada and with the United States and all of this kind of thing. Like it's not well thought out at all, and it's not serious. And there's no serious person that is in favor of this. So, well, I mean, it's true. It's like there's no.
It's pretty direct.
Well, I mean, like there's no Wexit party, like there's no serious Wexit movement. It's a term that is affixed to a sort of broader displeasure that a lot of, you know, basically Albertans and some Saskatchewaners have about the Trudeau government in particular.
It's more of a thought. It's more of a thought than an actual movement.
Yeah. And I mean, like it's a term that sort of gets to a larger sort of history in this country, which is like a history of what we call the Western alienation, like a sort of sense that like the government of Ottawa is insensitive and ignorant of the facts on the ground in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And of course, these days it's become just very partisan as well. And it's hard to like distinguish between to what degree is this like a valid, like a deep felt criticism of structural like inequalities in the Canadian state, and to what degree is it just a manifestation of the fact that Alberta and Saskatchewan are like by far the most conservative parts of Canada. Alberta in particular is becoming so conservative at the federal level, where the conservatives are getting elected by what my friend referred to as like Saddam Hussein style margins. Like conservative candidates get elected with like 80% of the vote. Like it's insane. And so it's like the fact that Alberta is becoming so conservative in that way, and that the Trudeau government is so loathed by conservatives, it just, it goes without saying that sort of like the rhetorical stakes would continue to get higher and higher and higher in a Trudeau second term. So I don't know. Like there's a lot of problems with Alberta that I'm starting to become like, as a conservative in this country, you're increasingly just supposed to sort of like genuflect to Alberta because Alberta is the sort of the home base of the conservative movement and is obviously very deeply loyal to the Conservative Party. But there's a lot of conservatives that are wondering if some of Alberta's problems are kind of beyond saving at the federal level, like that it's not just a product of Trudeau and that Trudeau hates Alberta and Trudeau hates Western Canada. But, like, for example, that there's like deep problems with the Canadian oil industry, like that it's just sort of like it's not very financially sustainable. Canada's sort of system of oil extraction is among the most expensive forms of oil extraction in the world. And thus, when the price of oil is low, we're at an enormous disadvantage in the marketplace. And sort of things like this, like that there's sort of like just problems with the Alberta economy that is so dependent on a single resource that's experiencing economic difficulties at the best of times, or at least economic sort of fluctuations, severe fluctuations at the best of times. And of course, now has to deal with the reality that, we live in an era of climate change. We live in an era of increasing energy diversification. And thus this industry is becoming more and more unfashionable. And that, there's a lot of like lack of investment in it, in part driven by economic considerations, but also driven by sort of like the political considerations, if this is really the energy of the future that we want to bet on, and this kind of thing. And so you have to sort of like wonder, like, well, to what degree does any federal government have the capacity to change those sort of like basic economic difficulties, which are, so I don't know. Like, as far as Wexit goes, like, I feel like if people are really serious about having a hard time with Canada, they should just talk about joining the United States. Like, if Alberta doesn't want to be part of Canada, it should join the US. And I don't say that like as an insult, because like I'm not anti-American, and I'm not saying that like as, oh, if you don't like it, get out. But I'm just sort of saying that, like, there's two systems on this continent, and I think that Donald Trump's America would be a much more favorable federal regime than Justin Trudeau's Ottawa, as opposed to just like some sort of like weird tiny Republic of Alberta that would just have to deal with Canada or America in some form or another. So, I mean, if Canada's not working, you may as well just try your hand with America. I think that an independent Alberta is a preposterous idea. But that's why, as I said, no serious person is proposing it.
Oh, geez. What was it? So we're like on like the 2-hour mark, JJ. Do you want to go and continue on with a couple more questions for a bit?
Maybe just a couple more. I'm getting pretty hungry though.
Yeah, I am too.
Just ask me some of the good questions.
Yeah, actually. Any thoughts? Yeah. Okay, let's go on this one. Any thoughts? This is from China number 1. Swear to God, these names. Any thoughts on collabing with JREG or other political YouTubers again?
I would really like to do more collaborations. Collaborations are a lot of fun. I like JREG. We have a weirdly lot of overlap between our two audiences, even though I guess that we're both kind of like nerds, and I think that people relate to both of us because we're very upfront about that part of ourselves. But yeah, JREG is a really cool guy. Greg is, and I like him, and I like working with him, and I hope to do it again. And I don't know what other political YouTubers people would like to see me do collaborations with. I mean, I don't think of myself as being a political channel first and foremost, but yeah, any sort of collabs I'd always be down for. And if people have ideas, they should get in touch, and not only let me know, but tell the other YouTubers that they should collab with me so that they feel some pressure on their side too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's entirely possible. I mean, I have a couple of ideas in terms of that, but that's another discussion for another day. But another question that's pretty good. I think this is really short, but it's pretty informative. Are you? This is from the Tech Toot. Are you considering changing your Saturday video Wednesday stream schedule?
Um, Not really. Saturday is sort of, I think, what people expect from me. I mean, I don't. I think, like, from what I've always learned, like when it comes to YouTube, there's no magic day that is better than others. It's really just about creating an expectation and a steady sort of schedule, and then staying loyal to it. So, I mean, I've been loyal to Saturdays for years, and I see no reason to change that. It works for me as well. Like, just planning wise, it's easy to spend a week on something and then upload it on Saturday. Um, and the streams on Wednesday seem to be going well as well. I mean, I might take a break at some point. Well, I'll just kind of get a little bit worn out and tired, and it's a lot of
Mhm.
talking, a lot of answering questions about my opinions on the Balkans and the Palestinian-Israeli
Oh,
conflict, and
jeez.
it's a little draining at some point. So, and I want to feel like I have useful things to say, and I'm not just sort of like rambling to
No,
fill
you're
time.
only for the Balkans. That's it. We only. Jesus Christ! I don't
Yeah.
understand this. This is gonna be a meme soon or something if people keep asking you about this.
I mean, it's like I have a very international audience, which is a good thing. Like, I like that my audience is as international as it is. And but one of the difficult things about having a very international audience is just that people often want to hear your opinion on their country. And it's like, unfortunately, a lot of times I just don't really have very strong opinions on a lot of parts of the world. And I mean, and I'm like I like to think I'm probably a little bit more informed about world affairs than your average bear. But even then, I have like, there's a limit to how much I can say of insight or interest. And
Yeah,
people are
no,
demanding it.
yeah. I could relate to that. People will come up to me saying, "Hey, Sam, you're pretty political." It's like I don't know what's going on in Malaysia, or like I don't know every little thing that's happening in these in like or in sub-Saharan Africa. Like I know some parts of the world that much more than the typical person. That doesn't mean I know everything though. I can relate to that, and I think a lot of
Yeah.
political junkies can kind of relate to that. But the next question that I think is good. It's from Poots. Do you listen to music at all? If so, what kind of music are you into?
People ask me this question, and I always give the same answer, which is that I'm very musically unsophisticated. I do listen to music a lot. I listen to it on my headphones when I'm walking, and to spend time when I'm drawing and all that. But like, I have terrible taste in music. Like, I mostly just listen to what my Spotify playlist tells me to listen to. The weekly recommendations and the release radar, or I just yell at Google to play something, and then I listen to what the Google playlist comes forward. I mean, I feel like I mostly just listen to like sort of like, I don't know, somewhat contemporary kind of hipstery kind of junk. I mean, let's see what's on my release radar thing right now. I mean, like, I see, like, I don't even know any of these bands. I just listen to the music that comes forward. Um, yeah, so I'm sorry if anybody's looking for any like great insight. I'm very kind of like embarrassed about how musically unsophisticated I am. Like, if people ask me what's my favorite band, it's like, I don't know. I just like listening to things.
I mean, I can kind of relate to that. I mean, before I was pretty like musically unsophisticated, I just listened to whatever. But I think over time, the more you listen to music, the more you'll find your taste.
Yeah.
But maybe that's possible. But let's see here. The next, I think, I think it's a really good question. Um,
All right.
Michael let's. Yeah, I think this will be the last one too.
All right.
This will probably be the last one because there's so much, there's so many questions and there's so much to talk about. But and JJ, just overall, you don't like when even with the questions that I expected you to kind of gloss over, you did kind of go on. Well, I was more than I expect, which is a good thing. I think it's good that you're giving more detailed responses because people just kind of tend to just say two sentences and they don't have more to say. It gets but I honestly think it's
Do
good.
people get these same sort of questions?
Well, no, I see that overall, like a typical person when they're asked a question, Crowd didn't have this problem at all. Crowd was actually pretty good with it too. But typically, people when they're asked a question, they give you like 2 sentences, and they feel like they don't really have more to say unless, like, with a lot of questions. And this is like, well, there's not really much to play off of that. But and I think this question I think is good because this does relate to you, I think, in a sense, as a conservative. Michael, Theater Geek, asks, as a conservative, how do you feel about mainstream conservative pundits such as Tucker Carlson and Ben Shapiro? Do you feel that their views are radical or do not represent traditional conservative values? Or do you agree with the majority of rhetoric coming from these types of people?
Well, I mean, like, I don't feel like either of those two specific examples I really enjoy all that much, if I'm going to be perfectly honest, because I feel like the thing about conservative punditry and punditry in general is that, and I say this as somebody who's sort of been engaged in this quite deeply myself, is that it's ultimately a job, and thus there are market incentives to do and behave and to act a certain way. So like both Tucker Carlson and Ben Shapiro are primarily like, they're kind of like sort of like entertainer type figures. Like they exist to give sort of like predictable arguments to audiences that already agree with them and sort of validate the opinions of a partisan audience, an audience of sort of like partisan right-wing Republicans who want to hear people smarter than themselves say partisan right-wing things. And it's like, that's fine. There's certainly a place for that. And these people have been very successful at building careers around that sort of style. But I don't know. I personally just find it becomes a little bit grating to listen to, a little bit tiresome. Like I don't feel like I'm learning anything when I listen to Tucker Carlson or when I'm listening to Ben Shapiro. And I feel like both of them are quite close-minded and quite just kind of like angry and irritable people. And I just don't find that personality very compelling or engaging or. So
I'm a little bit surprised by the answers, but by the how much, because I do understand, because especially Shapiro. I think Carlson once in a while throws a curveball at you with with people in general, like the anti-war stuff, and the capitalism is not a religion type of discussion. Shapiro, however, is so much more predictable than Carlson. I think Shapiro is much more predictable.
I mean, Tucker Carlson is predictable to me in the same way. I mean, like, sort of once you understand his sort of like basic disposition, it becomes pretty easy to understand his arguments. I mean, Tucker Carlson is just kind of like he's just, both of them are just very angry, And I just like, I just personally don't find that personality type compelling. I think it's just because like I'm like a person that doesn't tend to get angry very often. And so I can't imagine just getting out of bed every morning and just being like mad at the world and just ranting and rambling and then getting other people exercised about how angry you are. And isn't it great how angry I am? And this is like a sign of my passion. And I hate the left.
And how quick he talks and everything. Shapiro does that a lot too. He talks, and your opinion probably, you think your opinion probably matters, but I'm kidding. but like he says that in PragerU, I know it's a meme and stuff, but I don't know. Like, I think
they're like, the thing is like, but it's like what I was saying before, right? It's like it's their job, right? And they exist for a particular audience, and they've been very commercially successful, and I don't take that away from them. And people like the marketplace of ideas deserves to have a diversity of voices and styles and all the rest of it, because clearly there's a lot of people for whom what Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson are offering is exactly what they want. And so like and like you'll notice that like I'm not really making criticisms of any particular arguments that they make. It's more just kind of like it's about their style and their delivery and I mean, like, I guess part of that is a product of their view of the world, because they're obviously people that view the stakes of politics as being extraordinarily high and thus justify coming to the game every day with that kind of like huge chip on their shoulder and irritation and irritable persona in order to sort of like whip up their audience into feeling as passionately as they do. But I mean, that's just not the way that I think. And when I think about political commentators that I admire, it's ones that are a little bit more level-headed. yeah, a little bit more level-headed, just a little bit more mellow, a little bit more quick to concede uh, sort of like the unknowables of life, which is as I get older, like it's just harder and harder to deny the fact that like so much of politics is really like very subjective. And a lot of it is just like people that are very confident about politics are often very like I mean they're suppressing their internal doubts a lot in order to project an image of confidence, right? So it becomes this kind of like, which I think is somewhat deceptive to the audience, right? Because like what I was saying before is like a lot of political commentators, like the role they function is that most people don't have enough time to think and care about politics as much as they would like. And so what they do is they kind of outsource a lot of their opinion making to people that they perceive to be smarter than themselves, people who are more well informed and who are more articulate. And then these are the people that you read in the newspapers or see on television and sort of repeat your opinions back to them. And I think that gives these sorts of people comfort in believing that the world is in fact very, black and white, and that, the smart people like Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson don't seem to have any moral ambiguity and they're doing their delivery. Therefore, no moral ambiguity exists. And the world is very clear and very simple and very obvious. But I feel like Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson, when they're in their private moments, they probably know that that's not true. And they probably do have a lot of doubt about what they're doing and saying. But they know that they can't project that openly because that's not what the audience wants. And that's not how you get the good ratings and get the shares and all the rest of it. So I don't know. It's like I admire people that have the courage to be the opposite, because I do think it takes a lot more bravery to admit the limits of your own knowledge. And this is something that I struggle with as well, because you can see the way that I talk. I try to speak in this like confident way, and I try to come off like I know a little bit about everything. But I often feel like that there's so much I don't know, and that when I'm doing this interview with you, I'm feeling kind of like that there's a lot of stuff. Like every time I do an interview like this, where the questions are very open ended, I have to confront the limits of my own knowledge and how much I just don't know about so many things, and how hard it is to come up with intelligent sounding responses to very important questions that deserve better responses than I'm able to give. And I don't know, it's like humility is such a virtue in life, and I just wish more people could be more confident about saying that and modeling it.
Yeah, I think that's actually a pretty good opinion. I don't hear that often. But I guess the last thing to ask, I think is like for me, sorry for the people who couldn't get their answers, couldn't get their questions answered. There's just a lot to talk about, and 2 hours. You can only do so much with a little bit over 2 hours. But I guess my question to you, Jay, is before we end this is, would you be open to more types of discussions, not just in an AMA format, but would you be more interested in like being in a panel, almost like having multiple YouTubers, like this is like the collaboration type of thing? Like, would you want to be like with people who are more like YouTubers, like discussing with each other and such, and just overall be more open to collaborations and events such as that? What do you think about that, based off the experience you had so far with this AMA?
Yeah. I mean, I think that could be cool for sure. I mean, I think that sometimes the problem with when you're constantly just doing these kind of like very one-sided interviews, you sort of become a little too self-centered, right? And I think it would be fun. I'm not talking about like uh, debating people or anything like formal like that, but just sort of like being part of a discussion with more people with more knowledge than I have, or different knowledge than I have, or different perspectives than I do. I mean, as much as that might be fun for people to listen to, I feel like that would be a good thing for me and my own educational sort of journey to be part of as well. So, yeah, I'd be open to explore something like that.
Well, all right. So thank you, JJ, for coming to do an AMA with us. I appreciate it a lot. I think it was a good AMA. Again, I regret that we couldn't answer all the questions, but maybe for another time, who knows? But yeah, thank you everyone for coming. JJ, do you have any last words before we end it off here on your part?
No, thanks for letting me be part of this, and I'm glad to hear that you enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's no problem. All right, guys. So we're done here. This will be uploaded to YouTube probably later tonight, hopefully, depending on how early or how fast we can edit it. We'll, have the link and everything, and that's about it. All right, we're gonna end it off here. We're going to push everyone off into a different room and such, or we're actually gonna unmute everyone. So yeah, thank you, JJ, for coming.
Thank you for having me.
All right, you have a good one.